Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm here with my co-host, Misty Winston. And our guest today is Rachel Blevins. She's a journalist with RT America, and she's joining us for the first time. And we're looking forward to our conversation with her. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I know you both are guys that I've followed on Twitter, and I always enjoy getting to see your takes. I'm happy we get to sit down and have a conversation now.
Okay, so I know you were on Moats earlier and talked about this a bit, and probably have been talking about it for a bit in the past week or so. But Afghanistan, if we can start there, lots of developments even in just the past few days. But first, I guess in general, I'd like to get your take on the withdrawal, so to speak, because it doesn't seem like much of a withdrawal at this point.
Yeah.
And what are you seeing? What's your assessment?
You know, it's interesting that you put it that way because I think that that's a really good way to describe it, because we actually got a speech from President Biden in which he was openly saying, look, the United States has no place in Afghanistan. We're not going to win this war. That's clear after 20 years now. And he's talking about wanting to get the US out of it. But exactly, when you look at this country and you look at what the US is actually doing, it doesn't seem like they're really getting out of it, in the sense that, you know, they announced this withdrawal and then all of a sudden they admit that, oh, actually, we've got over 10,000 Americans that are still in this country. We've also got thousands of refugees we have to get out of this country. So we still need a US military presence in it. And then on top of that, now you've got top members of the Biden administration that are warning about this new offshoot ISIS-K. And it just feels like it's never going to end. It feels like when we finally get to that point of saying, oh, okay, are we actually going to end one of these forever wars, as they are widely called? I mean, people refer to them as forever wars as if that's something that has become normal. And then just when you think that maybe it'll end, then it gets to the point of where they're, you know, looking at ramping things up back again. And yet the messaging on it is that Biden is the one who ended this. That's kind of what people accept. And then they don't really look at much more after that. At least it feels that way.
Yeah. And what's really interesting to me is that we've had 20 years. Everybody's like, oh, we like, it was too fast. We've had 20 years. And it almost feels like it was this intentionally rushed thing so that it would cause chaos, so we would have a reason to, you know, reinitiate a presence there. It's so silly, because you're right. Now Biden is going to get credit for quote unquote ending this war, when in fact it's not ended at all. It's really just been like kind of reimagined. And now it's got a whole other purpose. And you know, I don't know. It's really frustrating to me to see so many people already giving Biden credit for something he hasn't done, as if he's not a proven liar.
Yeah, exactly. And as if there's not you almost kind of have to ask yourself, okay, why is the US doing this right now? Because this is a war that they've profited heavily from. I mean, defense contractors have raked in billions of dollars. There's a reason that they've been at this for 20 years now. And on top of that, I mean, I think a big part that has played into the fact that you had Bush, Obama, and Trump that all didn't completely withdraw from Afghanistan was because they knew that as soon as they did, the government that they created was going to fall in a matter of days, exactly as we saw, and that the Taliban was going to take over. So it really makes you wonder why all of a sudden now Biden would actually move to do that, when anyone who's paying attention would have known that, look, the Taliban's going to take control almost immediately.
Right. But given that, it's so apparent that Biden is discombobulated, to say the least. He and those
daily
those who are whispering in his ear, like Anthony Blinken and maybe Kamala Harris, though it seems like she's been floating outside the picture somewhere in Vietnam or wherever she's supposed to go next on her Southeast Asia tour. So it's hard to say if it's all chaos or if it's being stage managed in some way. What do you think about that? Because these aren't necessarily stupid people, but they aren't the smartest people in the room. You know, these are Beltway neocons who've really never stepped a foot in Afghanistan.
That's a good point. And I think that it's one of those cases where, I mean, honestly, it could go either way, in the sense that it's like either these people are just dumb enough to allow all of this to happen and they're looking for ways to then push this new ISIS-K group, or at the same time, they've got some bigger picture. I mean, we know that the US has been looking to ramp up tensions with Iran specifically over the last few years. And so there could be more to it than that. But I think it's also interesting how when you look at the Biden administration, you know, like you mentioned Kamala Harris, gosh, they're sending her off on this tour. They've challenged her with fixing our immigration system. And now on top of that, they're saying that they need all of these thousands of refugees, that they're going to send them off to other US allies and to neighboring countries and all that temporarily until they get special immigrant visas and can then send them back to the US. I mean, that's going to take years if that's actually their plan, because our immigration system is such a hot mess. It's like, it really makes you wonder, are they actually this stupid, or is there more at play that is just creating this kind of chaos, is what it seems like when you look at their foreign policy.
That's what I think. I think that this is all, I don't think they're, I mean, like Jesse said, they're not super intelligent people, obviously, but they're smart enough to know what they need to do in order to manufacture the kind of circumstances to keep these things going. You're right. They're making a ton of profit off of this stuff. Somebody tweeted out exactly how much profit all of these defense contractors are making. And it's like an exorbitant amount of money, and they don't want to let that go. And they know that the Afghanistan is hugely unpopular. I mean, people don't want to be there anymore. It's over 20 years. It's ridiculous that we're still there. But if they create just enough chaos, and you know, they're using the whole, oh, wait, what about the women? Won't somebody think of the women? And so they're using all of these emotional strings that they're pulling, which has been, I mean, just for me, you know, because WikiLeaks released the Afghanistan war logs. I've been having a field day pulling up all of these old, you know, cables that have been released by WikiLeaks. So like, look, this is exactly the CIA playbook that they plan to use in France, is to use feminism. We think of the women and the children, and that's how they continued to garner support for these forever wars. So I think that there's a level of them just knowing exactly what they need to do in order to keep the money rolling in, you know, and you're right. If it's not Afghanistan, it'll just be somebody else. We'll just move it elsewhere, whether it's Africa or Iran or who knows where, you know.
And we have to remember too that when Trump left office, the troop level in Afghanistan was somewhere around 2,500. Biden has ramped that up to 6,000. That doesn't seem like a withdrawal to me. And if you look at the subtle or not so subtle hints in the remarks he's made this past week about over the horizon capabilities, which is essentially code for smart war, which is essentially code for using drones, for using mercenary forces, basically unaccountable military forces. It really points to, I think, almost the fact that they don't have any plans of ending this war. They have plans of redrawing it or remapping it, as Misty said earlier. But you know, I think a lot of it is in the language of those remarks and the narrative they're trying to, however haphazardly, construct around this. And I don't think they really know how to coalesce all of that yet, but it's something that they're working toward.
Well, and the sad thing is that I think a lot of people do buy that narrative. I mean, when you hear the term ISIS, you're immediately like, uh-oh, that's bad. The US needs to go after them. Well, not to mention the fact that if we're talking about ISIS-K, the Taliban has already been fighting them for the last couple of years. You know, or like the case with the US saying that whenever the Trump administration assassinated Soleimani, the big picture that we heard from the media was, oh, this guy's bad. There was no talk about how he was also going after ISIS. And so it is concerning, especially from the standpoint, you know, of being here in the US and watching how people consume media, to see that as soon as they see those fear triggers, as soon as they see anything mentioned that they think would lead to us as Americans being less safe or something like that, they automatically are okay with whatever means the US decides to take. When at the same time, you look at the last 20 years and you imagine being a child who was raised in Afghanistan or Iraq. Over the last 20 years, you would hate America. So there's no way that we have been made more safe. There's no way that anyone in those countries actually looks at us and quote unquote hates us for our freedom. It's much more likely that someone who was raised there is going to want to come over here and kill Americans. And that's the United States' fault.
Yeah, no, it's completely illogical to go and blow up a country to make yourself safe. That doesn't work. That's the quickest way to make enemies. You're absolutely right. It makes, I mean, if you think about the devastation that we have wreaked, I mean, really across the globe, but specifically in Afghanistan for 20 years, of course, they're going to hate us. We have completely demolished their country without cause. I mean, we have no reason for being there. We have no right to be there. And, you know, I always tell people, imagine if that were you, like, imagine if that were your family and another country came in and demolished your country and killed your family members and, you know, all of this chaos. And then, yes, of course, you're going to hate them. Like, that's all that does is create terrorism. I mean, but that's what we want. I think that's exactly what we want. I think that we want, because then we have that threat level that we can then fight against or whatever. And they use scare words like ISIS. I mean, it's no different than the way that they've used Russia. They use Russia because we have this Cold War, you know, like beaten into our brains, and we've been thoroughly propagandized since the 50s to hate Russia. And so it's an easy scare tactic. It's an easy, and they use fear as, they use fear all the time as like an emotional manipulation tool to get people to do, you know, it's so obvious, and it's really difficult to get people to see it. They're doing it with COVID, in my opinion. And it's really difficult to get people to see that because they're scared. People are scared. And once you're scared, it's like your lizard brain cannot focus on anything else, you know?
Yeah. So let's, Rachel, if we can, let's talk about ISIS-K, or ISK as it's sometimes referred to. And the K stands for Khorasan, which refers to a region in Central Asia, which happens to include, maybe coincidentally or not so coincidentally, part of northeastern Iran. So you have been, it seems, one of the only people tweeting about this and the origins of this. And can you detail that a little bit more? Because for example, on the cover of the New York Post today, there was, you know, in big letters, ISIS threat, and Biden warning against that, and now also advising Americans to stay away from Kabul airport. So I don't know if the two are related, but yeah, as far as ISIS-K or ISK, can you break that down a little bit?
Sure. So I was reading about it earlier today, and I saw that term ISIS-K for the first time, and I was like, wait a second, first of all, what does the K mean? And then I heard the word Khorasan, and I was like, oh, I remember that, because back in 2014, I was just starting out as a journalist. That was when ISIS was viral everywhere. The media was covering them wall to wall. The Obama administration was trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and obviously not doing a very great job of that. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it was like CBS News, the Associated Press, all of these top mainstream media outlets started talking about what they referred to as the Khorasan group. And they described it as kind of this offshoot that was made up of former Al-Qaeda operatives. They said that they were super dangerous, that they were worse than Al-Qaeda and ISIS combined. They claimed that they had some sort of hard to detect explosives. And on top of that, they were also saying that they were going after the US homeland. Now, of course, they didn't really delve into any of that or how that was possible. And on top of that, they also used all of their anonymous sources. But then the Obama administration actually started warning about them. And they used it as justification to bomb Syria without any congressional approval. And they did so finding a way to basically say, hey, we found this hardened terrorist group, we have to go after them and bomb them. And the media, they were excited about it. They were talking about how great it was that the US was really tracking down terrorists and that they were getting rid of them, blah, blah, blah. Well, what's interesting is that group pretty much fell off the face of the earth after that, after September 2014. And I remember going back and Googling them a few years later, because I was like, what happened to this group? I mean, y'all said that they were the worst of the worst, and then now they've magically disappeared. And so it's interesting because I don't know that it necessarily is that Khorasan group, you know, morphing into ISIS-K or whatever, but it is notable how they use that terminology, that word, its relation to Iran, and then now all of a sudden they're talking about this new offshoot of ISIS, and you know that they're absolutely going to look for a way to tie it to Iran later down the road, you know, once we start talking about it more and more.
Yeah, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I'm sure you're familiar with them, neocon think tank. They have a pretty extensive primer on ISK. And what they say is, in part of it, despite initial skepticism about the group's existence from analysts and government officials alike, ISK has been responsible for nearly 100 attacks against civilians in Afghanistan, Pakistan, as well as roughly 250 clashes, we hear that word a lot, with the US, Afghan, and Pakistani security forces since January 2017. Though ISK has yet to conduct attacks against the US homeland, the group represents an enduring threat to US and allied interests in South and Central Asia. So I thought that was an interesting point or slip that they have there, that they're now trotting out ISK again as a threat to the US homeland, yet this group, which may or may not exist, has never attacked the US homeland. And I'm not sure what attacks they're referring to against US, Afghan, and Pakistani forces since January 2017. So it's very shadowy at this point.
And very vague. They always do this. They're very vague, and they're very, they use all the right scare words. And I think that the fact that it is going to be tied to Iran, I don't think there's any question that that's going to happen. I mean, they're doing that in Syria now, Iran
with all of
targets.
Right. They just come up with like Iran-backed militants, and that they just expect you to accept that terminology. And it is interesting to me that, we also have to remember with this quick rushed withdrawal, there were a number of media outlets that admitted that the US left behind millions of dollars in weaponry and equipment. And at the time they said, oh, well, that'll probably just go to the Taliban. Well, we've kind of seen this song and dance before, where all of a sudden they start warning about a militant group, and then that militant group is magically driving around Toyota trucks and, shooting weapons that came directly from the US. And it kind of makes you wonder if that, it is Joe Biden back in power, after he went through all of this when he was vice president with Obama. So, it would not surprise me if that's kind of what they were starting to cook up there.
Somebody tweeted the other day that there was talk of them potentially blowing up the base where they had left all that stuff. And I'm like, so wait, we're going to use our weapons, our taxpayer weapons, to blow up our taxpayer weapons because y'all were too stupid to take them with you when you left? Like, what is happening? It's so ridiculous. It really is cartoonish, actually. I mean, it's not, again, we've been there for 20 years. This isn't like, this sprung up on us like out of nowhere and we had to like think on the fly. We've had 20 years to figure out a way to get out of there effectively, and with, causing the least amount of chaos and damage as possible. And it's very clear that that was never the intention, that this was they always wanted this chaos. I think that the scenes out of the airport, they want to drum up the sympathy again. They're playing on everybody's heartstrings. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't feel bad. What's happening in Afghanistan is absolutely horrendous. It has been for 20 years. But the people who are, now freaking out about what's happening, have been pretty silent for 20 years. And it's just, at some point, some consistency would be nice.
Oh, absolutely. And the people who are talking about being concerned about the civilians there, it's like, where were you whenever the US was bombing weddings, hospitals, schools? The US and its allies have been committing horrific war crimes in this country for 20 years now. And yet people all of a sudden care when they leave. It is incredibly hypocritical to me. And I know especially those of us who have been speaking out about it on the internet for the last several years, trying to drum up just awareness for it. It's crazy to suddenly see people become aware when they see a couple of different viral clips, but it's like, that's another reminder that the mainstream media in the US does not show you the aftermath of their bombs and their drone strikes. They don't show you what it looks like when there are horrific civilian casualties as a result of the United States. They'll show you whenever Russia did it. They'll show you whenever any other country, Iran, anyone like that, they'll show you, oh, look at this happened, this country did this, but they won't show you when it's your own people and your own money that's going towards it.
Yes, we've talked about this with Danny Scherzen on several occasions. Ever since the Vietnam War, they've learned not to show the, what happens with war, like what happens when the U.S. is waging war. Like we'll see the white helmets videos, and we'll, like you get to see all of that, but we don't get to see what happens when we get to see the bombs taking off, and then Brian Williams has like, an orgasm on live TV and is like freaking out about how beautiful it is, but we don't get to see where that bomb lands.
As he quotes Leonard Cohen.
Yes, which that was so gross. But we don't get to see where that lands.
He was almost hit by that bomb. Just say.
He was there. He barely escaped with his life, Rachel. Why are you laughing at him?
But I think what really gives the lie to this concern, this sudden humanitarian concern, is not only that people who are seeking refugee and asylum status are being repatriated to countries around Afghanistan, but look at how many people the US personally repatriated after the Iraq War, which is still happening. There's still a war in Iraq, but look at that number and how abysmal that's been. It's pathetic, especially when you compare it to the scale of destruction that the US has wrought on Iraq. And I think we're going to see the same thing with Afghanistan, which all points to the fact that the US doesn't care about these people. It cares about the resources it can extract from their territories, and any other geostrategic advantages it can reap, but it doesn't care about the people. It doesn't care about nation building, whatever that means anymore.
That's anybody believes that we give a shit about humanitarian anything hasn't been paying attention to US foreign policy for the last 100 years. You know?
Oh, absolutely. It's like, no, you don't go overthrow governments and then spend years bombing countries because you care about the civilians so much there. And I know there's another topic that I kind of covered this week, which is that now what the US has done is they've set up this, or before they had set up this government in Afghanistan that was basically reliant on US funding and US support. And so when they withdraw that support, they withdraw that funding, the government falls. Now all of a sudden these civilians there that have become reliant on the US occupying their country, they're pretty much screwed, because what the US is doing is they're not only pulling that funding, but they're also freezing the $9.5 billion in assets that Afghanistan has here in US banks, because of course they're saying, well, we can't give that to the Taliban. We can't let them have access to that. And so now they're kind of showing the people of Afghanistan the other side of US war, which is where, hey, we're not bombing you every single day, but we are freezing all of your resources and basically starving you out for as long as you can survive and for as long as we decide, because we don't like what your leadership is doing right now, even though it's the United States' own fault that the Taliban now is bigger and badder than ever and has more control than ever in Afghanistan.
And has better weapons because we left them.
Yeah.
And as far as aid, the IMF has cut off all aid to Afghanistan as well. And we know what usually happens when the IMF makes such moves. So that's
when even the IMF is like, look, we're not going to put you into ridiculous debt in order to give you money. Like that's not a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not.
So we've heard a lot of talk about Russia and China as well, and where they factor into this. There's been a lot of talk about Russia and China building and sustaining diplomatic and economic relations with the Taliban, especially as pertains the lithium resources that are in Afghanistan, but also creating a way to circumvent US imperial influence and, basically benefit their nations without having to be under the boot heel of US imperialism. What's your take on that?
I think that doesn't necessarily surprise me. I think it is interesting that the US is kind of pulling back, because that has been their sphere of influence, so to speak, and they've profited heavily off of the natural resources in Afghanistan, including, the opium production there has skyrocketed under the United States, and that has not had a good impact even here in the US. But at the same time, it is kind of interesting to see the US now getting mad at China or Russia or anyone else for going over or wanting to go over to have any sort of relations, whether it's with the Taliban, whether it's with, some new sphere of government that they create. Now the US is all of a sudden pointing the finger and saying, oh no, you can't do that. And it just is a reminder of how the US has continued to try to control what everyone else in the world does. And it's like they don't want to have relations with certain countries, but at the same time, they want to control what everyone else is doing. And it's interesting to see kind of how that plays out in real time, and also how that is portrayed by the media, because in 2020, the US really pulled back from Venezuela specifically. They hammered Venezuela with sanctions. They stopped importing crude oil from Venezuela. And then as a result of that, who jumped up as one of our top importers of oil was Russia. And that's something that wasn't talked about at all, was the fact that, the US is pointing their finger at Russia and saying, hey, you can't do this Nord Stream 2 deal with Europe. You can't do this, you can't do that. But at the same time, the US is also saying, hey, we need you to be one of our top oil importers for our country so that we can have your oil. It's just not something that's really covered in big time. So I think it is notable to see how the US is going to continue to only really shine the spotlight on any future deals that China or Russia do with Afghanistan when it suits them. And then there's probably going to be a lot more going on that they just don't talk about if it doesn't play into that exact narrative.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you too about the media reaction to the withdrawal, whatever you want to call it, of Afghanistan, because they freaked out. I think it might've been with Ned Price. I'm not sure, but there was a press conference the other day and they were like just flabbergasted that we were going to pull out of a war. There's never any questions when we want to start a war. They never question, there's never like a freak out, like, oh my God, why are we doing this? Why are we entering into this war? What's the plan? There's never that. But when we want to pull out of a war, it's like you're taking like candy away from a child and they freak out. And it's so interesting to me, how bad the media is in the United States. You're lucky enough to work for RT. I think RT does a pretty good job of covering things in a real way. But the mainstream media in the United States is absolute garbage. And I think that over the past week, we've really seen that with it's really like a little tantrum. Like they're freaking out that we're pulling out of Afghanistan. They have all the talking heads on. They're having Bush administration officials on to talk about Afghanistan. Like, what is wrong with you? So I don't know.
It seems like the media is almost just as offended because they were the ones who helped the US government get into these wars to begin with. I mean, they were the ones who sold it hook, line, and sinker that this was for our freedom and for our safety and blah, blah, blah. And even in all of the cases where, you were mentioning like the Afghanistan war logs, I mean, the mainstream media as a whole doesn't really want to talk about those. They don't want to talk about all of the corruption that has happened over the last 20 years. They don't want to essentially piss off any of their buddies in the government. They don't want to lose any of their connections or lose any of their advertisers for that matter. And so it was interesting and also completely ridiculous to see their reaction as if that this was something new, as if they'd completely forgotten that the US was still fighting a war in Afghanistan. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the American people don't really think about it. They have kind of forgotten about it. I mean, I have friends where I'll mention it and they'll be like, wait, we're still there? We're still fighting a war? And it's like, yes, we are. And it's year 20. And, to see kind of the way that the media has handled just everything with the Biden administration, because one of the big things that I always said about their coverage of the Trump administration was, look, they're going to complain about his tweets. They're going to complain about some ridiculous remark he made, but they're not actually going to talk about any of the war crimes he commits and really go in depth into them, because that's not their thing. That's not something they do with anyone. And so with Biden, to now see them actually have to be critical in a way, but at the same time, they're critical of the fact that he would dare end a war that the US can't possibly win. I mean, if people were kind of on the back and forth of trying to decide whether or not they should trust the media, I feel like that kind of gives you your answer right there, especially when it comes to all of those mainstream networks. And, you mentioned, I mean, gosh, it's like people like Tony Blair, like George W. Bush have gotten their, renewed 15 minutes of fame over the last week by speaking out and saying that it was bad to end this war that they started. It's like, I'm sorry, are you mad that it lasted 20 years? I don't know how long you thought that it was going to last, but
these are people who should be in The Hague. Like they shouldn't, they shouldn't be interviewed by, some turd at CNN or MSNBC. You should be in jail. You should be in prison. Like, I don't care. Like, if you think it's a bad idea that we left Afghanistan, because you should just be in jail. I don't know why we even I do know why, because our mainstream media is garbage. But I mean, and you're right. During the Trump administration, it was all about their tweets. I mean, it was pretty obvious when they freaked out because he said mean things about Jim Acosta, but didn't breathe a word about Julian Assange. You know what I mean? Like, oh, he said a bad word to Jim Acosta, poor Jim Acosta. And meanwhile, Julian Assange is being tortured and you have nothing to say about that. But they all pretend to care about freedom of the press. So, I mean, it's really
Jim Acosta, who essentially assaulted an aide who was taking care of the microphone so he could ask a question that was not even important in the least. Nobody even remembers the question he was asking. Everybody remembers him trying to grab or bat away the microphone or whatever he was doing to that poor young woman. So, but I think when we talk about the media here, we have to look at it from the point of view that they're not focused on a materialist analysis of what's actually happening on the ground with regard to from the Taliban regrouping to Russia and China and the pipelines that they have planned or that they're trying to build with other nations that are going to probably incorporate Afghanistan, but also circumvent geographic areas where the US has influence on purpose so that they, like I said earlier, they can create their own sort of conglomerate or working group, if you will, that releases them from under the boot heel of US imperialism. There's no, in the mainstream media here, there's no, they don't even touch that. They don't even hint at that. It's all seems to be coming from this like beltway bipartisanship. And, you know, Republicans don't like the way Biden did it. Democrats don't like the way Biden did it, but it's like in-house politics. It has nothing to do with the larger geopolitics, which is what I think we should be paying attention to. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's what, you know, that's kind of the cycle that we've gotten into with Republicans and Democrats acting like they're on opposite sides of the aisle and then magically coming together to agree on however, you know, $750 billion we're going to spend on our defense budget this year. And that's almost kind of been the, you know, what they've done with media. They've tried to act like, oh, CNN and Fox News are on opposite sides of the spectrum. It's like, no, they actually agree on a lot in terms of what they cover, what they shove down your throat, what they refuse to cover. They all kind of follow the same corporate media pipeline. And, you know, when it comes to countries like China and Russia, it's like they've almost got the same talking points about those as well. And I think it's really interesting being able to work for RT, because anyone who hears about RT automatically has kind of their own view of it that they've gotten from like the Wikipedia page. Like they've read the 3 sentences and they know exactly what RT is according to them, but they don't actually take the time to watch our coverage and to see that a lot of these people that are employed by RT that are actually speaking out, one, we're saying what we want to say without anyone telling us what to say, but we're also getting a chance to cover these stories, to talk to experts in the field and to really talk about what's going on in Afghanistan or what the Biden administration is doing today. Or, you know, I'm co-hosting Boom Bust right now, and a lot of the stuff that we cover is what the Federal Reserve is doing and how these policies that the Federal Reserve has in place are, you know, helping the richest Americans and at the same time doing absolutely nothing for everyone else. But they're also pushing us to a point where the US economy is in a really troubling spot right now. You know, when we look at the fact that inflation is at its highest point in 13 years, and we're all sitting here going, well, wait a second, why isn't the Federal Reserve making changes to their policies that would at least put some sort of debt in that? Why, you know, are they keeping the policies that they are? But it's like when you turn on those mainstream networks, they seem to just kind of dumb down that information for you, and they don't really get to the heart of it, which is, you know, the policies that are put in place that are impacting every normal American, and they just don't seem to see it. And then a lot of them don't want to turn on RT because they're worried that, you know, it's going to line up with whatever they think that it's going to line up with.
Yes. So many people are like, oh, you watch RT, it's Russian propaganda. First of all, it's not really. I mean, it's, to me, I love RT. RT is probably my favorite. I think it is my favorite news source. Like
as if we're too
mainstream.
As if we're too dumb to decipher propaganda when we encounter it.
What do they think CNN is? What do they think MSNBC is? It's propaganda. It's state controlled propaganda. I mean, corporations own CNN and MSNBC. Corporations own our government. It is state controlled propaganda. And you're right. Fox News and CNN are owned and operated by the exact same people. They give you different perspectives because they know that they have two different, it's like they know that there's like this false dichotomy and they have to feed both ends of it. And so they do that. But it's really coming from the exact same place, and it's really coming from the exact same like talking points, like you said. And it's so apparent and it's so obvious, and it's really nefarious because it's, I mean, just complete like just drowning people in propaganda on a daily basis. And that's why I like RT, because it's not you get coverage that you wouldn't get anywhere else. And that's not to say RT is perfect. There, I mean, it's got its own stuff and all of that, but it's far better than CNN or MSNBC. It is like, it's not even a close call. And I love it when they say that, oh, well, people who work there are Russian agents. And I'm like, Lee Camp's a Russian agent. Chris Hedges is a Russian agent. Are you serious right now? It's infantile, but I think you're right. People are just afraid of it. It's the thing. It's the using Russia. It's a scare word. And so anything that has to do with Russia, you have to be afraid of. And that's unfortunate because I think a lot of people are stuck in the mainstream media bubble, and they're just getting grossly misinformed. And it's a huge, I think that in my opinion, the media in this country is one of the biggest threats that we face, for sure.
I agree. And I think that the ongoing social media censorship that we're seeing is also a really big threat, because I know I started out in all of this freelance writing, and basically I had a number of independent websites that I was able to write articles for. And then Facebook came along and decided that it was going to clamp down on any sort of independent media, and the revenue from that just dried up. And so, I know that I'm one of those people who are incredibly lucky to get to work with RT, but at the same time, it's like, that's one of the few places where I can go have a reliable job and actually be able to cover these stories that I'm passionate about and being able to get them out there, where a number of people end up, which of course, I think if you end up at CNN or Fox News, you either believe what you're selling or you believe in, the paycheck enough to kind of get you there, but you're not going to end up there if you're really passionate about actually calling out the US government and all of the crimes that it commits on a daily basis.
For sure.
Yeah. And a lot of mainstream media now, like CNN, Newsweek, MSNBC, it's not about reporting the news. It's about clickbait. And the first guest we ever had on this show, Tarek Khadad, who's based in the UK, he resigned from Newsweek because they wouldn't let him report on the OPCW cover-up with regard to Duma and the chemical weapons attack that never happened there. And when I spoke to him, he detailed sort of the inner workings of the Newsweek office where he worked in London. And he said that most of his assignments throughout the day were him sitting at a desk, and he was given these but pretty much wholly clickbait articles to write. Sometimes they had to do with important issues, but most of the time it was infotainment. And we're seeing the same problem here in the US. It's just it's already oversaturated with that. And, whatever little space there is left for genuine discourse you're not going to find it in the mainstream because it doesn't sell. It's not
and
sexy.
It's being strangled in independent sources. Rachel's absolutely right about that. I mean, we're seeing it across YouTube. How many channels have been taken down, deplatformed, demonetized? I mean, I liken the demonetization of independent media to sanctions. It's literally like sanctioning independent media. They want to silence dissent. And they're going about it on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and algorithmically, even just Googling things. You can't get legitimate information, and they really are clamping down harder and harder and harder every single day. It gets worse. I mean, now there's the thing on Twitter where you can report something for being quote unquote misleading. Who decides what's misleading? It's so ridiculous. It really is.
Yeah, exactly. And then you look at these fact checkers and you're like, okay, where are you getting these fact checkers? Because I remember when I first started out in 2014, a lot of these independent sites were getting more clicks than CNN and Fox News on Facebook. They had social media figured out. They knew that they were presenting articles that people were not able to get anywhere else. I had worked with the Free Thought Project. I don't know if y'all are familiar with them. But I worked with them for a couple of years. And then we also did some work with the Anti-Media and Carrie Wedler. She's a really big YouTuber. And we're talking about these sites that they're not left, they're not right. They are putting out information there. They are calling out, the US war machine for everything that it is. And they were getting deplatformed left and right. And it's so frustrating to watch that and to think that, you may be just the average person on Facebook. You decide you're going to like and follow a page, and then you never see any of their content because Facebook has decided that they don't want you to see their content. And it's like, why are we in a world where people are not allowed to have the most basic choice of being able to choose which kind of information they consume and where it comes from? I mean, to think that there's some kind of big tech lobby that is literally going in, changing up the algorithm so that you can't see what you have decided and put out there that you want to see, that's just crazy. And there's always going to be some kind of agenda to it. And I think that scares me more than anything when it comes to that, because people don't even realize how much of an impact it has on what they're seeing and that on the beliefs that they form as a result of it.
Yes, I call it, people are being like, it's manufactured reality. You don't have like real information. You are force fed information. And it's from every angle all day long. It's in commercials, it's on every magazine cover, it's on every billboard. It's like constant propaganda. And you're right. We have no choices. They give you the illusion of choice. They give you the ability to go and like a page, but you're still not going to see any of their stuff. And it's really, really frustrating. And that's, I mean, being a WikiLeaks activist and free speech activist, that's why I love WikiLeaks. It's not conjecture. It's not some talking head, like giving you their opinion. It's just source documentation. Here's the facts. You do with this what you want. And that's my favorite, that's it. That's everything, because it really does make journalism as much as a science as possible. But I think people are just completely unaware of the levels that they're going to in order to control everything that you see, hear, read, think. I mean, it's really starting to, and it's some, we'll have people, I get into this argument all the time with people about how, well, it's a private company. No, it's really not though. They're completely intertwined with our government. The Atlantic Council, the Atlantic Council is a huge red flag. I mean, they work hand in hand with Facebook to decide, who gets free speech and who doesn't. That's terrifying. I don't want, there should be none of that. And even if it was a private company, they shouldn't have the ability to control who gets free speech, who doesn't, what information you're allowed to see, what information's, authoritative sources and all of this stuff. It's insanity. I'm a grown-up. I can handle choosing what information I want to see and hear and read and think and know. And it's really getting worse day by day. It's you're right. Scary is the right word. It's terrifying that we're at this point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also notable that, that the Trump administration didn't quite go about it in the right way, but one of the points they did bring up was just how much power social media is allowed to have. And yet when you talk about these companies like Facebook and Twitter, they enjoy the freedoms of being a platform. They tell the government, hey, we're a platform, we're going to let people come and post freely, but then at the same time, they're making the decisions of a publisher. And yet no one in Congress is able to stand up to them and say, actually, no, we're going to, change this to make sure that you are treated like a platform, if that's what you say that you are. And then, anytime that Congress decides that they're going to try to do something with the latest round of antitrust bills that were proposed, you had Tim Cook literally calling Nancy Pelosi. He called her up and he was like, hey, we need to talk about this before you guys. That to me is crazy. It's like, yes, you've got these top members of and sure, these heads of the top social media companies will come testify before Congress, but the majority of that is just them explaining the internet to all of these, 80-plus-year-old members of Congress who don't understand what they're actually talking about.
Those hearings are so funny because they all look really confused.
Who was the congressperson who asked straight up to Mark Zuckerberg, how does Facebook make its money? How does Facebook make its revenue? I don't remember, but it was funny. That was funny stuff. That was really, what really terrified. And I think that they did it to Trump because he was Trump. But the fact that Donald Trump, a sitting president, was able to be completely erased from the internet, like even Pinterest took this guy down. He's a sitting president. That should have terrified everybody. But instead, you had people on the left cheering that on like it was a good thing. And I think that that's a very intentional thing. I think that's why they start with like an Alex Jones or a Donald Trump. They do it with the most offensive, most universally reviled types, because then it manufactures consent for them doing it to everybody across the board. And for whatever reason, the left is too stupid to know that that's what they're doing. And so every time this happens, you'll find them cheering it on. And then you have Congress people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also cheering on authoritarianism, using her email list to
to get people to mass report accounts that are, putting out things that she doesn't like. A cop was sent to some guy's house because he made a joke about her online. And it's really troubling that's it. There's like this crazy authoritarianism on the left that is just really mind-boggling. I don't understand it. It's like they never learn from history.
And yet they claim to be concerned about the police. I'm like, yeah,
right.
And now you're calling for these authoritarian measures. Like, who do you think is going to be enforcing those measures? That's one of those things that I'll never understand. And I remember when Alex Jones got completely deplatformed. It was back in 2018. And when that happened, you're right, there were so many people cheering it on, and they're like, he's a terrible human being. And I immediately said, guess what? This isn't the end of it. And sure enough, it was like 2 months later, I lost my Facebook page with nearly 70,000 followers, and a number of other independent sites completely were deplatformed from Facebook and from Twitter. I was lucky that I'm still able to be on Twitter, but hey, post, they completely deleted my page altogether on top of that. And so it is crazy to see in that situation. It's not like you can just call up some sort of, tech support and tell them, hey, you deleted my page. Like, no, it is virtually impossible to contact Facebook. Trust me, I've tried.
There's nobody there's nobody to call. Like I've had people who have gotten their Twitter pages taken down and they've like appealed, but that's all you can do. You can appeal like online, but you can't like call and talk to a human being and be like, hey, this is done, we shouldn't have been done. This was a mistake. This is I was just making a joke or whatever. It's very obvious. There's nobody for you to call, and there's no way to remedy the situation. And they're taking down like Venezuela Analysis, they took down that, what was it, like 20 some odd pages that they took down recently. It's crazy. It's like news sites that they're taking down, and it's just anything that steps outside the approved establishment narrative. And we're seeing it happen with COVID, especially now, that if you talk about COVID in any way that is outside the establishment, they'll come for you. They'll take your page down. There was a time where the Last American Vagabond lost his YouTube channel over talking about the lab leak theory, and then like 6 months later, it's on Stephen Colbert, and it's fine that everybody can talk about it. And I'm like, wait, just 6 months ago, they were taking people's entire pages down, and now it's like an approved thing that you can discuss. But who gets to decide that? That's what I think a lot of people are missing. Is I don't want some Silicon Valley tech bro deciding who gets free speech. That's not something anybody should be okay with.
It's really dangerous when they refer to it as misinformation, because it's like, or disinformation, or any of those terms, because it does make you wonder, okay, who's making that decision and who's deciding what is actually truth? And especially, when you're claiming, I know like everything surrounding COVID right now, there is this really big push to not talk about literally the US government's vaccine injury website. Like, if you share a link to the US government's website talking about anything related to vaccine injuries on Facebook, it's automatically taken down. And it just makes you wonder. It's like, okay, well, that may be accepted speech later on down the road, but for these independent creators that have put everything into building their platforms on, what are major social media sites. I mean, you can have all of these sort of fringe other platforms that you want to, but at the end of the day, all of us creators have to come back to Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, wherever we're allowed on right now. And we put so much time and effort and our entire livelihood into creating a following on there. And then they just get to wipe it away, in seconds. And they have no sort of consequences for that. Like, there's no way for they feel nothing, essentially.
Yeah. There's no recourse. There's no way to challenge it.
Yeah.
And as far as the reporting to the CDC goes, people like you, people like me, we can't see what information is submitted to them. It's a private database. So that in itself right there should be a scandal, at least on the national level. But so then add to that the fact that if you talk about that in any way on social media, that you get canceled. I mean,
We're just supposed to
brave,
accept that they're telling us the truth. Like the government is telling us the truth. People who are known liars, the pharmaceutical companies, known liars, like they're murderers, like they're known murderers. That's not,
well, and
it's not hyperbolic.
Right. And I think it's interesting to see how this term of anti-vaxxer has really just become larger than life.
Oh.
And it applies to, now they're talking about, this vaccine hesitancy. Well, you should have hesitancy about just about anything in this life. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't, consult with your doctor and make your decision for yourself. But at the same time, it's like the fact that, however, I don't remember the exact number, but the Biden administration is fueling millions of dollars into going after vaccine hesitancy. Mm-hmm. And, they're riling up celebrities and influencers online to try to get you to take a vaccine. It's like that right there almost creates more red flags than anything else, when in reality, what they should be doing is allowing people to have that choice, allowing them to get it, giving them the freedom to do that, and not putting them in this place where if you ask any question about it, then all of a sudden you're placed as an anti-vaxxer and you can't speak out online, and all of these things happen to you. The second they do that, then they are undermining their entire message, and they're making even more people question why that's happening in the first place.
100%. And listen, because I get called an anti-vaxxer all the time right now. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. In fact, I say this all the time. In 2015, I have a child who's autistic. So I was very in the trenches of the pro-vax fight. Autism is not caused by vaccines. I was in the trenches of that. I'm on a list in 2015 of people that anti-vaxxers hate. So there's no way anybody could ever call me an anti-vaxxer. I am vaccine hesitant. That's not even it, really. I don't trust the government person. I don't trust the pharmaceutical companies. Nobody should. I'm not saying anybody should or shouldn't get the vaccine. That's the personal choice you make with your doctor. But don't come for me for asking questions. And what really frustrates me the most is that so many people are spending time being mad at their neighbors for being hesitant or for not trusting the government or pharmaceutical companies, when they should be mad at the government and the pharmaceutical companies for creating an environment where such distrust is so prevalent. That's the problem. That is the problem.
Well, technically you are an anti-vaxxer based on the Merriam-Webster definition. And I have to give credit to Max Blumenthal for pointing this out. If you look up anti-vaxxer on their site, it's a person who opposes vaccination or laws that mandate vaccination.
They changed that, I think, recently. Somebody tweeted it out that they changed it recently, that wasn't the initial definition that they had, that's been changed recently.
Right.
That's crazy.
That's the new definition.
Yeah, but you don't get to just change the definitions of words to suit your agenda. That's not an okay thing. That's not an okay thing.
Especially when you're talking about something that not only is personal, given that you're literally putting something in your body, but if you have any sort of side effects for it, they do not care. The pharmaceutical companies have they have nothing
complete immunity.
Terms of any sort of, they have no liability to actually make sure that you're okay as a result of that. And you're talking about these major pharmaceutical companies that have paid out billions upon billions of dollars because they were negligent. Because Johnson & Johnson and some of the stuff that they've done with their products that cause cancer. And
arsenic in baby formula.
Yeah, it's and that's not, I think this is a discussion we should have, and we should be able to talk about it, because that leads to accountability for these major pharmaceutical companies, because clearly the US government has shown they're not going to try to fight for any kind of accountability. But when the public has a discussion about it, when they start talking about what these companies are doing, and they start throwing out the idea of boycotting their products and actually making them take the public health and well-being seriously, when they're literally creating products that affect all of us, that's when you actually get real change to happen. So the idea that any of that conversation would be stifled is incredibly concerning, especially when we're talking about a pandemic and wanting to find solutions to it. That's one of those hills that I will forever die on, because it makes no sense to me how people can justify mandates, how they can justify the government forcing you to do something when, like you said, this is a government that lies about just about everything. It's just
And where does it end? Because it's not going to end at bars and restaurants. it could very likely get to the point where you're trying to organize a rally and get permits for a rally, and they mandate that
We're talking about a no-fly list.
Everybody has to prove
for the unvaccinated.
Everybody has to prove they're vaccinated in order to participate in the rally.
Listen, if you want to mandate vaccines, then how about some Medicare for all? How about that?
Yeah.
How about that? If it's really about my health and well-being, then how about you just give me healthcare in the middle of a goddamn global pandemic? It's ridiculous that we don't have healthcare in this country in the middle of a pandemic, but they want to force a vaccine into my body. Then give me healthcare. Okay, let's do that.
Right.
Let's do that. Deal, trade. We'll trade. It's a good trade. Ugh,
and there's no conversation about health and wellness, like especially over the last year, the state of this country's mental health, people that have lost their small businesses, that have lost their jobs, people that are struggling, there's no conversation about that. All they need you to do is just take this vaccine, and then God knows however many booster shots they add onto it. And I think that is incredibly concerning, especially when you're talking about, kids going back to school now, and kids who have been forced to stay home, and to learn online and that sort of thing, and going back to school, and just bringing all of this political nonsense into their lives like that. It makes me so sad for those children who are in elementary school who are having to live with this, because they shouldn't even have to worry about it at all.
Yes, I can tell you, like I said, my oldest is autistic, and I can tell you that staying home last year was unbelievably damaging. It was unbelievably damaging. The social anxiety that she's feeling now, she's afraid to go to school. She's afraid, you know what I mean? It's, and we don't talk about the damages of lockdowns. We don't talk about how that is extremely detrimental to people's mental well-being and all of that stuff. That's not a conversation that we're allowed to have. And people want to have their cake and eat it too. If you want to lock down for a couple of months or whatever, I don't think it's going to make any difference, because this is something that's endemic. I don't think a lot of people are talking about that. I don't think this thing's going anywhere. It's just going to be with us. We're going to have to learn how to just survive in society with it being part of, our lives. But if you want to lock down for a couple of months, fine, I guess, but you need to provide the ability and resources for people to do that and not suffer and struggle, pay people and make sure that, right now we're talking about the eviction moratorium being extended for 60 days. What people aren't talking about, and as a leftist, I get shit on all the time for bringing this up, because listen, I don't like landlords. They're not I'm not a big fan of landlords, but I also know that if landlords lose their houses, BlackRock buys them up, and that's not good for anybody.
Yep.
But nobody's talking about that. Nobody wants to have that conversation. They're worried about renters, and they're worried about the eviction moratorium for renters, but they're not talking about landlords losing their properties and BlackRock buying those all up. And that's not a good thing. We don't want that to happen. And that's what's happening. But there's so much to this that people just aren't talking about.
Yeah. And then on top of that, I know this was a story I covered a couple weeks ago, and I want to say the number, I could be wrong on this, but I want to say the number's around 45 million. But the Congress passed renters, or they basically passed aid for renters and for landlords. I want to say it was to the tune of $45 billion, but they passed it, they sent it out to the states, and only 10% of it has actually been spent and has been given out and used. I'm going, where's that money? Because if you're saying that Congress actually did something and they actually passed some sort of relief, not only for the renters, but yes, also for the landlords, who then have to pay their mortgages for the people who are living in their houses, and that whole sort of ecosystem. If you're saying that Congress actually did something and that money was handed out, then where has it gone? Why isn't it being spent?
And why are there no penalties for those states for not getting into the right hands? And
I think a big part of the problem is that the allocation of that money depends on whether or not a locale is a COVID hotspot, which is the term they use. And that's ever shifting. What's a COVID hotspot one day, like Provincetown, for example, once they, eradicate that, or the levels go down substantially enough that it's no longer a hotspot, however the government chooses to designate that, another one's going to crop up. And so how is there any financial stability in the way this so-called aid is doled out?
Incentivize communities from getting their COVID numbers down, because you're going to lose your aid. It's such a disaster the way that we're handling this. It really is, just across the board. Everybody said Trump was bad. Biden's no better. And anybody who was paying attention could have told you that was going to be the case. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think that it causes a lot of concern, especially from the standpoint of, I remember back in 2016, there were a lot of people who would question the government a lot more. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump came along and they were like, oh, well, he's the outsider candidate. He's going to fix everything. You know, he's going to keep all of his campaign promises like no one else. And then he got into office, was no different than the rest of them. And those people just kind of shut down and they stopped actually questioning the government and what it was doing. And it feels like now we're having kind of a resurgence of that, just on the other side of things in a sense. And then the people who are really hardcore Trump supporters are almost on the opposite end, where it's like they don't take any of the virus seriously. They don't, you know, and it's like they just go so far on the other end. It's like, okay, no, we need to have some sort of middle ground here where, yes, we take this seriously. Yes, we have some form of safety precautions, but we do it in a way that is smart. And we allow the conversation about what is best for our individual states and for our country as a whole, you know, because shutting down that conversation, shutting down those questions that people are asking, especially when it comes to, like you mentioned, the effects of lockdowns and how it is impacting people. I mean, how have suicide rates skyrocketed? How have suicide rates skyrocketed specifically among younger Americans? Like, what does that mean for the Americans who are just starting out and are just, you know, either trying to go off to college or leaving college and going off into their lives? I mean, there really is a lot at stake here. And I feel like too often we're not there. Congress just wants to sit there and they want to bicker back and forth about politics and claim that, you know, they're, you know, just in this never ending fight. And it's like, why don't we actually talk about something that's for the good of the American people, which y'all are supposed to serve? Not that they do.
It would be amazing too if the people, it doesn't matter if you're it's so dumb that we just have two parties, but it doesn't matter if you're team blue or team red. It's very clear now. You would think that at this point it would become very clear. Neither of them care about you. Neither one of them give a shit about you. So how about we just come together and figure out what we can do together to deal with that problem? Because it's a huge problem. Our governmental, the system in general is a huge, massive problem. But you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Do you want to let everybody know where they can follow you, what you have coming up on RT, the show, tell everybody when all your shows are on and everything? So, because you're one of my favorite journalists right now, so I want to make sure everybody can follow your work.
I appreciate that. I'm glad I got to come on and talk with you and actually see you guys in person. I swear, I see so much of you guys on Twitter, and I know I will say, Misty, your Twitter name was the one that I saw, and I was like, oh, this is interesting, and had to give you a follow. And I think my dad follows you too, and so it's nice to actually get to talk. he is very involved, and he's like, I mentioned that I was coming on your guys' podcast. He's like, oh yeah, I know her, I follow her, and I'm like, I love that. Okay, so he will be happy to come back and watch. But no, I am on RT America pretty much every weekday. Right now I'm co-hosting Boom Bust, which you can find at 4 p.m. Eastern, and it also replays, and you can also find all of our shows on YouTube. So we talk about a little bit of everything. Boom Bust is a lot of fun because we kind of get into the world of business, finance, technology, you name it. We have some really great experts on, so I really encourage people to check that out. And then of course you can always find me on Twitter and Instagram at Rach Blevins, and I'm there as much as I can be. Whenever we talk about censorship, it always concerns me so much when it comes to Twitter, because I'm like, do not mess it. I love Twitter so much. I know. Need it to stay that way.
I have a love-hate relationship with it. Yes. And Rachel's also a frequent guest on Moats, like we said earlier. She was on earlier today. I love George Galloway, so it's always a blast when you're on that show too. So everybody should check that out as well. Thank you for coming on. Seriously, we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
And like I said, you're one of my favorite journalists, so it was really cool to be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. And you're welcome back anytime. So
I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'd be happy to come back on. It's been great to talk to you guys.
Cool. Thank you very much. And we appreciate everybody watching, and we'll catch you next time.